pulling in the corks and the webbing of the net. At least that's what you're supposed to do. But in reality, the net was so heavy that when I tried to pull it in, it wouldn't budge. What really happened was that in trying to pull in the cork line, I actually pulled in the boat. I pulled it along on my own power since the net stayed where it was. I did all this for weeks on end. It was almost the end of me, too. I ached horribly. I ached all over. I ached for months. When I finally did have the chance to rest, I slept on a damp, lumpy mattress piled on top of the provisions locker. I'd put one of these lumps in the mattress under the part of my back that hurt most and sleep as if I'd been drugged. I was drugged by complete exhaustion. I'm glad now that I had to endure all that aching and exhaustion because it helped me stop worrying. Whenever I'm confronted by a problem now, instead of worrying about it, I say to myself, Erickson, could this possibly be as bad as pulling the cork line? And Erickson invariably answers, no, nothing could be that bad. So I cheer up and tackle it with courage. I believe it's a good thing to have to endure an agonizing experience occasionally. It's good to know that we've hit bottom and survived. That makes all our daily problems seem easy by comparison. I used to be one of the world's biggest jackasses. By Percy H. Whiting, author of The 5 Great Rules of Selling. I've died more times from more different diseases than any other man, living, dead, or half dead. I was no ordinary hypochondriac. My father owned a drugstore, and I was practically brought up in it. I talked to doctors and nurses every day, so I knew the names and symptoms of more and worse diseases than the average layman. I was no ordinary hypo. I had symptoms. I could worry for an hour or two over a disease and then have practically all the symptoms of a man who was suffering from it. I recall once that in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, the town in which I lived, we had a rather severe diphtheria epidemic. In my father's drugstore, I'd been selling medicines day after day to people who came from infected homes. Then the evil that I feared came upon me. I had diphtheria myself. I was positive I had it. I went to bed and worried myself into the standard symptoms. I sent for a doctor. He looked me over and said, "Yes, Percy, you've got it," and that relieved my mind. I was never afraid of any disease when I had it, so I turned over and went to sleep. The next morning, I was in perfect health. For years, I distinguished myself and got a lot of attention and sympathy by specializing in unusual and fantastic diseases. I died several times of both lockjaw and hydrophobia. Later on, I settled down to having the run-of-the-mill ailments, specializing in cancer and tuberculosis. I can laugh about it now, but it was tragic then. I honestly and literally feared for years that I was walking on the edge of the grave. When it came time to buy a suit of clothes in the spring, I would ask myself, should I waste this money now when I know I can't possibly live to wear this suit out? However, I'm happy to report progress. In the past 10 years, I haven't died even once. How did I stop dying? By kidding myself out of my ridiculous imaginings. Every time I felt the dreadful symptoms coming on, I laughed at myself and said, "See here, Whiting, you've been dying from one fatal disease after another now for 20 years, yet you're in first-class health today. An insurance company recently accepted you for more insurance. Isn't it about time, Whiting, that you stood aside and had a good laugh at the worrying jackass you are?" I soon found that I couldn't worry about myself and laugh at myself at one and the same time, so I've been laughing at myself ever since. The point is this: don't take yourself too seriously. Just try laughing at some of your sillier worries and see if you can't laugh them out of existence. I've always tried to keep my line of supplies open. By Gene Autry, the world's most famous and beloved singing cowboy. I figure that most worries are about family troubles and money. I was fortunate in marrying a small-town Oklahoma girl who had the same background I had and enjoyed the same things. We both try to follow the golden rule, so we've kept our family troubles to a minimum. I kept my financial worries to a minimum also by doing two things. First, I've always followed a rule of absolute 100% integrity in everything. When I borrowed money, I paid back every penny. Few things cause more worry than dishonesty. Second, when I started a new venture, I always kept an ace in the hole. Military experts say that the first principle of fighting a battle is to keep your line of supplies open. I figured that that principle applied to personal battles almost as much as to military battles. For example, as a lad down in Texas and Oklahoma, I saw some real poverty when the country was devastated by droughts. We had mighty hard scratching at times to make a living. We were so poor, my father used to drive across the country in a covered wagon with a string of horses and swap horses to make a living. I wanted something more reliable than that, so I got a job working for a railway station agent and learned telegraphy in my spare time. Later, I got a job working as a relief operator for the Frisco Railway. I was sent here, there, and yonder to relieve other station agents who were ill or on vacation or who had more work than they could do. Now, that job paid $150 per month. Later, when I started out to better myself, I always figured that that railroad job meant economic safety, so I always kept the road open back to that job. It was my line of supplies, and I never cut myself off from it until I was firmly established in a new and better position. For example, back in 1928, when I was working as a relief operator for the Frisco Railway in Chelsea, Oklahoma, a stranger drifted in one evening to send a telegram. He heard me playing the guitar and singing cowboy songs, and he told me I was good, told me that I ought to go to New York and get a job on the stage or radio. And naturally, I was flattered, and when I saw the name he signed to his telegram, I was almost breathless: Will Rogers. Instead of rushing off to New York at once, I thought the matter over carefully for 9 months. I finally came to the conclusion that I had nothing to lose and everything to gain by going to New York, giving the old town a whirl. I had a railroad pass. I could travel free. I could sleep sitting up in my seat, and I could carry some sandwiches and fruit for my meals. So I went. When I reached New York, I slept in a furnished room for $5 a week, ate at the automat, and tramped the streets for 10 weeks and got nowhere. I would have been worried sick if I hadn't had a job to go back to. I'd already worked for the railway 5 years. That meant I had seniority rights. But in order to protect those rights, I couldn't lay off longer than 90 days. By this time, I'd already been in New York 70 days, so I rushed back to Oklahoma on my pass and began working again to protect my line of supply. I worked for a few months, saved money, and returned to New York for another try. This time I got a break. One day, while waiting for an interview in the recording studio office, I played my guitar and sang a song to the girl receptionist, "Janine, I Dream of Lilac Time." While I was singing that song, the man who wrote it, Nat Schildkraut, drifted into the office. Naturally, he was pleased to hear anyone singing his song, so he gave me a note of introduction and sent me down to the Victor Recording Company. I made a record. I was no good, too stiff and self-conscious, so I took the advice of the Victor recording man. I went back to Tulsa. I worked for the railway by day, and at night I sang cowboy songs on a sustaining radio program. I liked that arrangement. It meant that I was keeping my line of supplies open, so I had no worries. I sang for 9 months on the radio station KVOO in Tulsa. During that time, Jimmy Long and I wrote a song entitled "That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine." It caught on. Arthur Satterley, head of the American Recording Company, asked me to make a recording. It clicked. I made a number of other recordings for $50 each, and finally got a job singing cowboy songs over radio station WLS in Chicago. Salary $40 a week. After singing there 4 years, my salary was raised to $90 a week. I picked up another $300 doing personal appearances every night in theaters. Then in 1934, I got a break that opened up enormous possibilities. The League of Decency was formed to clean up the movies, so Hollywood producers decided to put on cowboy pictures, but they wanted a new kind of cowboy, one who could sing. The man who owned the American Recording Company was also part owner of Republic Pictures. "If you want a singing cowboy," he said to his associates, "I've got one making records for us." And that's how I broke into the movies. I started making singing cowboy pictures for $100 a week. I had serious doubts about whether I would succeed in pictures, but I didn't worry. I knew I could always go back to my old job. My success in pictures exceeded my wildest expectations. I now get a salary of $100,000 a year, plus one-half of all the profits of my pictures. However, I realize this arrangement won't go on forever, but I'm not worried. I know that no matter what happens, even if I lose every dollar I have, I can always go back to Oklahoma and get a job working for the Frisco Railway. I have protected my line of supplies. I Heard a Voice in India by E. Stanley Jones, one of America's most dynamic speakers and the most famous missionary of his generation. I have devoted 40 years of my life to missionary work in India. At first I found it difficult to endure the terrible heat, plus the nervous strain of the great task that stretched before me. At the end of 8 years, I was suffering so severely from brain fatigue and nervous exhaustion that I collapsed, not once but several times. I was ordered to take a year's furlough in America. On the boat returning to America, I collapsed again while speaking at a Sunday morning service on the ship, and the ship's doctor put me to bed for the remainder of the trip. After a year's rest in America, I started back to India, but stopped on the way to hold evangelistic meetings among the university students in Manila. In the midst of the strain of these meetings, I collapsed several times. Physicians warned me that if I returned to India, I would die. In spite of their warnings, I continued on to India, but I went with a deepening cloud upon me. When I arrived in Bombay, I was so broken that I went straight to the hills and rested for several months. Then I returned to the plains to continue my work. It was no use. I collapsed and was forced to return to the hills for another long rest. Again I descended to the plains, and again I was shocked and crushed to discover that I couldn't take it. I was exhausted mentally, nervously, and physically. I was completely at the end of my resources. I feared that I would be a physical wreck for the balance of my life. If I didn't get help from somewhere, I realized that I would have to give up my missionary career, go back to America and work on a farm to try to regain my health. It was one of my darkest hours. At that time, I was holding a series of meetings in Lucknow. While praying one night, an event happened that completely transformed my life. While in prayer, and I was not particularly thinking about myself at the time, a voice seemed to say, "Are you yourself ready for this work to which I have called you?" I replied, "No, Lord, I am done for I have reached the end of my resources." The voice replied, "If you will turn that over to me and not worry about it, I will take care of it." I quickly answered, "Lord, I close the bargain right here." A great peace settled into my heart and pervaded my whole being. I knew it was done. Life, abundant life, had taken possession of me. I was so lifted up that I scarcely touched the road as I quietly walked home that night. Every inch was holy ground. For days after that, I hardly knew I had a body. I went through the days working all day and far into the night, and came down to bedtime wondering why in the world I should ever go to bed at all, for there was not the slightest trace of tiredness of any kind. I seemed possessed by life and peace and rest, by Christ himself. The question came as to whether I should tell this. I shrank from it, but felt I should, and did. After that, it was sink or swim before everybody. More than a score of